Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Battleship Bismarck Part 24. All in all, the destruction was frightful. Everything up to the bridge bulwarks had been erased. Stumps indicated the columns on which nautical apparatuses had once rested. The big binoculars in the middle of the bridge, remarkably enough, were undamaged. On both sides, close to the wings of the bridge, the remains of anti-aircraft guns identifiable only by the seats for the men who had directed them remained. Cardinal and Statz now sought shelter behind the bulwark, but had to leap constantly from side to side, for shells continued to hit, mainly on the tower mast and below it. The heavy trunks could be seen clearly with the naked eye as they rushed through the air. After a leap to the starboard side, Statz was surprised to glimpse another living being there. He was sitting on the bridge deck, immobilized by serious leg wounds, an officer with 4 stripes on his sleeve, a Fregattenkapitän. Bracing himself against the deck with his left hand, he sat completely upright, and around him only the dead. He was observing the bombardment with professional interest. What a fine, neatly styled haircut he had, thought Statz. What beautiful, lustrous white hair. Then the hits had Cardinal and Statz on the run again, and Statz fervently hoped that the lieutenant would take the initiative and tell him the best way to get down from here. Yet he began to feel that it was he himself who had to lead now. Cardinal had changed. His previous question to Statz, "Well, friend, did they get you too?" were the last words he would ever speak. After them, he kept silent. He, for Statz, always the officer. An example, an expert, a soldier, a man with whom one could move mountains. But Statz no longer recognized him. From their position, they had a completely unobstructed view of the flak control centers on both sides aft, standing like fingers in the sky, completely untouched, as though nothing had happened. Nearer, fires were swirling up to the more elevated Admiral's Bridge, the smoke coiling itself into dense swaths. The bridge itself appeared undamaged, the windscreen glass intact, but no one could be seen there. Statz said, "I'm not going below to the starboard." Cardinal merely nodded. It really looked horribly high from up here. On the starboard side, the upper deck was already towering far above the sea. Several voices from below bawled, "Gas! Gas!" And then a direct hit beneath the bridge silenced them. On with the gas masks, Statz told himself, and pulled it on, but immediately felt suffocated. In his excitement, he had not unscrewed the microphone cover, so off with the mask again, and by then the gas had blown away. Now he and Cardinal peered forward again towards the main turrets, whose terrible condition brought tears to Cardinal's eyes. Then they saw a British cruiser approaching with guns blazing, and the bridge deck again reverberated with impacts. But the little cruiser shells weren't so bad, not nearly so bad as the battleships' 406 and 356mm impacts, which shattered everything beyond recognition wherever they hit. The Fregattenkapitän must have fallen victim to a direct hit, for the place where he had been sitting was no more. Looking to port, Statz saw a rope ladder made fast forward of the flak control center and told Cardinal, "This is our chance." Then, suddenly, the firing ceased. What a blessing, and it became possible to walk upright again, diagonally across the bridge deck where the conning tower had once stood, up to the bulwark. Statz helped Cardinal over, the latter climbed on the rope ladder and immediately fell like a stone, blissfully unhurt, to the lower bridge deck, for the belaying knots of the ladder had burned through. The fire was most intense here, and somehow Statz managed to get down to the lower bridge deck too. There, an absolute wasteland, nothing recognizable remained. Now, down again to the Aufbau deck, dangle part of the way, jumped the rest. And another leap to the middle port 150mm turret, whose roof was intact, if in other respects it no longer resembled a gun turret. From there, they saw some comrades who had sought shelter behind turret Dora, the first living man, in an apparently endless time. They heard the national anthem sung and a triple Sieg Heil, and saw men leaping into the sea. Not a soul came from anywhere else in the forepart of the ship. Besides Cardinal and Statz, no one escaped the hell there. Some men were trapped below. The hatches leading to the main deck, particularly on the port side, were either jammed shut or there was heavy wreckage lying on top of them. Again, more so on the port side, where wreckage from the forward command tower, including louvers to the boilers, had been ripped away by direct shell hits. In compartment 15 near the forward mess on the battery deck, 200 men were imprisoned behind jammed hatches. They were all killed by shell fire. Flames cut off the whole forward part of the ship, and one of the starboard 150mm turrets had been hit and its access hatch was jammed. No amount of effort from inside or out could pry it open. The turret became a coffin for its crew. Farther aft, 2 men who had managed to reach the main deck were blinded by the dense smoke and fell through holes in this deck back into the fire below. There were young sailors, petty officers, even men of the prize crews, experienced seamen, who decided it would be pointless to try to climb out. With the silencing of our guns one after the other, the doctors' and corpsmen's hour had come. And in what dimensions? Hundreds of wounded lay where they had been hit, in the foretop, on the bridge, in the control stations, at the guns, on the upper deck, and on the battery and main decks. Stretcher bearers, including civilians, carried them from the upper deck amid a hail of shells, but the only thing that could be done for such numbers was relieve their pain by giving them morphine. None of those who really knew what feats were accomplished in the dressing stations and at the collection points lived to tell the story. The task of the doctors and corpsmen became overwhelming as one action station after another was knocked out and the men who were no longer able to take part in the fight crowded the battle dressing stations. As the minutes passed and ever great numbers of wounded requiring ever more attention pressed into the stations, the possibility that our medical people would have a chance to save themselves became slimmer and slimmer. The armor of the battery and main decks within the citadel offered them no protection as they labored amid a stream of heavy hits, every casualty providing them with a preview of what lay in store for them. What they suffered was the epitome of what observers in 2 British ships preferred not to imagine. A British sailor is quoted as, "What that ship was like inside did not bear thinking of. Her guns smashed, the ship full of fire, her people hurt, and surely all men are much the same when hurt. Pray God, I may never know what those shells did as they exploded inside the hull." Referring to the 45 minutes of relentless cannonading that followed the silencing of our guns, Captain Dalrymple Hamilton said, "I can't say I enjoyed this part of the business much, but I didn't see what else I could do." Captain W.R. Patterson of the King George V would have stopped firing earlier had he been able to see what was happening on Bismarck, but the wall of splashes from near misses obscured his view of her port side. The doctors and the corpsmen endured the horror and helped the wounded until they themselves fell victim to a hit. When and where they died, I do not know. Only the direct hit in the action dressing station aft has been recorded. Marineoberstabsarzt Hans-Günther Busch, Marinestabsarzt Hans-Joachim Krüger, Marinestabsarzt Arvid Thiele, Marineassistenzarzt der Reserve Rolf Hinrichsen, and their corpsmen and assistants are here remembered with a special respect. This is as far as I can reconstruct Bismarck's last battle from my own experiences and from the testimony of others. The concentration of hits on the forward section of the ship in the opening stage of the battle explains why Bismarck's command system was crippled so early. Only afterwards did I understand why, once the battle had started, not one order or message from the bridge reached me in my aft fire control station. To us participants, each phase of the action seemed much longer than it actually was. By 09:02, 15 minutes after the first salvo was fired, the foretop, the forward fire control station, and turrets Anton and Bruno had been disabled, which meant we had lost more than 50% of our firepower. No one who was in those forward action stations survived, and my report from the perspective of a position aft can only be a fragment. No survivor saw the fleet commander during the last battle. I assume that Admiral Lütjens and his staff fell at their action stations. While the little group I was with was waiting to starboard, forward of turret Dora, Bismarck sank still deeper by her stern and her list to port increased. The gradual emergence of more and more of her hull on the starboard side told me that the moment to jump was approaching. "It's that time," I said. "Inflate your life jackets. Prepare to jump." Just as earlier it was vital not to go over the side too soon, now it was vital not to delay so long that we would be sucked down with the ship when she finally sank. "A salute to our fallen comrades," I called. We all snapped our hands to our caps, glanced at the flag, and jumped. In the water we were pushed together in a bunch as we bobbed up and down like corks. At first we swam away from the sinking ship as hard as we could to escape her suction. When I got clear by some 150 meters, I stopped and turned around for one last look and to take in everything I could about her. What I saw was that Bismarck was listing still more. She had no stability left. She was also deeper down by her stern, her bow rearing steeply out of the water. The whole starboard side of her hull, all the way to the keel, was out of the water. I scrutinized it for signs of battle damage and was surprised that I saw no trace of any. Her port side had borne the brunt of the battle, and that side of her hull may have told a different story. When swimmers close to the bow of the ship looked back, they saw Lindemann standing on the forecastle in front of Torret Anton. His yeoman was with him. Soon, both men went forward and began climbing a steadily increasing slope. Lindemann's gestures showed that he was urging his companion to go overboard and save himself. The man refused and stayed with his commanding officer until they reached where the jackstaff had been. Then Lindemann walked out on the starboard side of the stem, which, through rising ever higher, was becoming more level as the ship lay over. There he stopped and raised his hand to his white cap. Bismarck now lay completely on his side. Then, slowly, ever so slowly, she and the saluting Lindemann went down. Who among us knew that at this moment there was being fulfilled the demonically strange youthful yearning of a man who at the age of 13 had conceived a passion for the navy and had then repeatedly told his brothers and his friends that his greatest wish was one day to command his own ship and to go down in her with flying colors. Later a machinist wrote, "I always thought such things happened only in books, but I saw it with my own eyes." The time was 10:39 hours, and the battleship's position was approximately 48 degrees 10 minutes north and 16 degrees 12 minutes west. At 13:22, Group West radio to Lütjens. Reuter reports Bismarck sunk. Report situation immediately. But at the place where such messages had previously been received and answered, there was now only empty sea. The sight of the sinking Bismarck and the thought of my many comrades who had gone down with her cut deep into my heart. It suddenly occurred to me that a priceless portrait of Prince Bismarck himself had sunk with the ship. It hung where the guard outside the commanding officer's stateroom was posted. 3 weeks earlier, when Hitler visited the ship, Lindemann pointed it out to him and was obviously concerned about the possibility of something happening to it during the war. Hitler shook his head. "If anything happens to the ship," he said, "the picture might as well be lost too." Now it had come to pass. And another thought came to me. Had the great ship that had just sunk before my eyes borne the name not only of one great statesman, but also of a conceived navalist, a supporter of mighty battleships such as the Bismarck had been? Hardly. To the contrary, as I remember from what I had learned in school, in Bismarck's day, the policy of the German Empire had been determined by fundamentally continental concepts. Bismarck had once even referred to the nearly pathological naval enthusiasm of 1848, and when in 1897 the State Secretary of the Imperial Naval Office, Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, visited him at Friedrichsruhe, Bismarck had refrained from giving his hoped-for blessing to the great German naval build-up, which was then beginning. He had told Tirpitz that he did not like it with big warships. Instead, many small ones were needed, and almost angrily rejected the idea that Germany could enhance its alliance value by a strong fleet. No, to the end of his life, Bismarck had retained his reservations about the building of a great German battle fleet, true to his earlier idea that in regards to England, it would be well, in conjunction with France, to maintain a certain counterweight at sea, but that war with England was never to be desired. A battleship as big as Bismarck, or even a bunch of them, would certainly not have been his goal. He had declined an invitation that Tirpitz transmitted on the occasion of his visit to Friedrichsruhe to participate in the launching of the armored cruiser Fürst Bismarck on grounds of age and health. For us in the water, the scene changed quickly. We found ourselves being continuously swept from one cluster of men to another. In the distance, I saw the familiar faces of Kapitänleutnant Werner Schock, commander of Division 12 and 2nd Damage Control Officer, as well as Oberleutnant Gerhard Hinz, commander of Division 8 and the ship's technical gunnery officer. I saw them briefly, then they were lost to sight forever. All of a sudden I found myself next to the ordnance man from my action station. "Careful, careful," he called out. "Don't get too close to me, I've lost a foot." "Listen," I replied, "we'll soon be aboard a Briton and they'll take care of you." Shortly thereafter, he too disappeared in the swells. Like toys, we floated on the heaving Atlantic. Only when we topped the crests of waves did we catch glimpses of the horizon. Were there any British ships around? Would they come to our rescue? Although there were none in sight, I was quite sure they would come. Repeatedly I called to the men near me, Stay together. As soon as a ship comes, we'll swim over and get aboard. It wasn't much encouragement, but I thought better than none at all. Even today, when I think about being out there in the Atlantic, it strikes me as remarkable that I was not conscious of the temperature of the water. It was 13 degrees centigrade, cool enough, but I was fully dressed, which helped keep me warm. And, still more important, the tension and excitement were such that external circumstances didn't matter. In our helplessness, all we thought about was what's going to happen, what's coming next. The minutes flew past, and the water temperature meant nothing to me. One thing that was really horrible was the fuel oil from our sunken ship that was floating on the surface of the water in a wide, thick sheet. Its odor stung our noses, it blackened our faces and forced its way into our eyes, noses and ears. What luck, it's not burning, I thought, although I knew that was not much of a danger with heavy oil. My Tissot wristwatch stopped at 10:31. Salt water and fuel oil, the combination was too much for it. We continued to float in high swells. There were still no British ships to be seen. When almost an hour had passed from the crest of a wave, I sighted a 3-stacked cruiser, her ensign stiff in the wind, the Dorsetshire. I urged my companions to hold on. Cheer up, we'll soon be aboard her. The Dorsetshire steered for the thickest concentration of survivors and stopped shortly before reaching it. Soon she lay athwart the waves, drifting and rolling rather heavily. I had quite a long way to go to get to her. I told the men in my vicinity to be sure to head for the port or lee side of the ship and stay there. Dorsetshire threw lines over, a few of which had bow lines on the end. Lines and bow lines became so slippery from the oil in which they dangled that it was difficult to handle them, but it was that or nothing. I had a vision of a white net up which a lot of men could climb at the same time as they would up red lines, but it was only a vision. At last, Dorsetshire lowered a rectangular wooden raft for us to hold onto so that we could catch our breath. Getting up those lines was not easy, even for an experienced seaman. Not only were they slippery as eels, but because of the rolling of the ship, they were in the water 1 second, and the next they were too far above our outstretched hands for us to grab. It was quite a trick to catch one at the right moment. Most of the men I saw were technicians, who had probably not had to use lines since they were in basic training, so I advised them to choose those that had bow lines. That too was easier said than done. I soon found that there was a limit to what the best intention advice could accomplish. At some points men bunched up, all trying to grasp the same line, while lines nearby were ignored. Feeling that I was strong enough to do so, I decided to wait a while. Then I noticed that certain lines were almost always free. I called attention to this fact and swam to one with a bowline. I don't remember how many times I was within a few feet of the line for a fraction of a second only to have it jerk far out of reach. I almost gave up, but then I was lucky. Just as the ship was about to roll back up, I got one foot firmly in the bowline, closed both hands round the line, and gave the 2 British seamen above a signal to hoist. They did, and slowly, I went up the grey hull, past the portholes, how high can a ship be, to the upper deck. I reached one hand out to grab the lifeline, intending to hold on it as I climbed out of the bowline. But my reach was longer than my grasp was strong. One hand was not enough to hold the line, and I fell back into the water. Fortunately, I didn't land on anyone's head, nor did I hurt myself, but it was very disheartening. Had I so greatly overestimated my reserve of strength? I wouldn't wait long before I tried again. After getting my breath, I looked for and found another line with a bowline. I glanced up, and there were the same 2 seamen. Unwittingly, I had returned to the same line. They hoisted me up again, and this time I kept both hands on the line and said, "Please, pull me on board." They did, and there I was, standing on the upper deck aft of the second port lifeboat, a prisoner of war in an oil-stained uniform. The first thing I did was take a look over the side at my comrades still in the water. There were hundreds of them, hundreds of yellow life jackets. Perhaps 800, I estimated. It would take a good while to get them all on board. That they would all be saved, I had no doubt, but I was not allowed to stay on deck for long. Others were now the masters of my time. Also, my 2 rescuers had to carry on with their humanitarian work. One of them, Tom Warham, a young telegraphist, obeyed an officer's order to take me below to the midshipmen's quarters. Little did I know that barely a year later he would be amongst the survivors of the Dorsetshire when she was sunk in the Indian Ocean by Japanese dive bombers. After the war, he became a good friend of mine in that unique brotherhood that, as he once wrote to me, binds men who once fought on opposite sides. Below, I saw some of my shipmates in various stages of undress. They were being given dry, warm clothing. My allotment was the civilian suit of an obviously very large officer. Here are some more accounts of the sinking. Stabsobermaschinist Wilhelm Schmidt went over the stern into the water and found himself surrounded by 300 or 400 men. From a distance of 100 meters, he watched Bismarck roll over, saw her keel uppermost and air bubbles rising from under her. Then she sank. After he'd been in the water a long time, he spied mast tips on the horizon. They belonged to Dorsetshire, and, together with many others, Schmidt soon found himself on her port side, the lee side. Amidships, he found a stout manila line with an eye at the end of it. Some of his companions had already been hoisted up when he succeeded in getting a grip on the line and was pulled up. Musikmat Josef Mahlberg was also 100 meters away from the Bismarck when she capsized. Just as I did, he looked for signs of torpedo hits or other damage to the starboard side of her hull and saw none. Maschinenmat Wilhelm Generotzky, who was standing on the superstructure deck, saw men jumping into the water, among them his best friend. He also saw Luftwaffe sergeants shoot themselves and heard a chief engineer say, "If I had a pistol, I'd do the same thing." Then there were shouts, "She's sinking!" and "Torret Dora's blowing up!" The deck was trying to slide out from under him. He and several others leapt down and went into the water from a starboard side of the upper deck. At almost the same moment, that side of the ship rose completely out of the water. The jump must have brought a quick end to many of those men. Generotzky's leap took him to a considerable depth, and as he fought his way to the surface, he kept telling himself, "It'll get light any minute now. It'll get light any minute now." When that finally happened, he shot halfway out of the water and sucked precious air into his empty lungs. He saw Bismarck some 100 meters away, floating keel up. Hissing jets of water, escaping from various apertures in her hull, were soaring into the air. While he watched, her stern sank, her bow rose, and, as if in last farewell, with a gurgling sound, Bismarck slid below the waters. All that was left were the men in the waters, hundreds of them, fighting a desperate battle with the elements. Generotzky did not expect to be rescued. He had lost his socks, and cold pressed ever deeper into his body. His legs became numb. Floating oil burned his face and hands and forced its repulsive way into his mouth. It took him about 40 minutes to reach the Dorsetshire and the many lines that had been thrown over. He let himself be lifted up by a wave and grabbed hold of one of the lines. But in the trough of the wave, he lost his hold and fell helplessly back into the cold bath. Several other times he tried, but in vain. As more and more men reached the ship, a struggle for survival broke out. When 2 or 3 men would try to hang on the same line, none of them made it. In the scramble, someone stepped on Generotzky's head, and while he was underwater, a wave threw him against the ship's hull, injuring his leg. Noticing that the British seamen aft were tying eyes into more lines, he floated in that direction, managed to get his foot through one of them, and clamped both hands to the line. Seamen pulled him on board. And with Generotzky being rescued, it is time for the after-action report. In this episode, we hear some more survivor accounts, especially we hear about people choosing their own fate or fighting for survival. We also learn about Lindemann, who chose to go down with his ship, standing tall. There's a lot of suffering that we are being told, and I don't know if you've caught it, but there was one story about the crew of a secondary gun turret, which took a glancing blow that jammed the hatch. They were alive when the ship went down, fully knowing that there was no escape. But even if you survived the initial bombardment and shelling, survival in the water was no guarantee of making it out alive. As you know, a couple of hundred men made it into the water from the burning ship, but only 116 were picked up alive. Most were picked up by Dorsetshire, some were picked up by Maori, a destroyer, some by U-74, and a few by the weather ship Sachsenwald. We've learned about the Dorsetshire survivors in this episode, and we will learn about the others in the next episode. Until then, stay safe, cheers, and bye-bye.